Hi there, welcome to Haunting Vales. This is your favorite host, Noah. What you're about to hear isn't legend, it isn't horror fiction. This isn't one of those stories that gets told around campfires or stitched into urban myths. This happened. It was investigated, documented, judged, and condemned. A woman died. And whether you believe her soul was lost or saved is up to you. But don't listen to this alone. Some stories feel heavier in silence. Tanacu is not a destination. It's a disappearance. Tucked away in the northeastern hills of Romania, the village is the kind of place that seems to fold inward on itself. Maps barely acknowledge it. Roads forget to finish. The terrain rises in jagged gasps of stone and forest, the trees curling inwards like secrets. There's no reception, no billboards, no neon. Just the slow breath of the hills and the silence that clings to every structure. Most Romanians couldn't point to it on a map. Even locals nearby speak its name softly. And if you ask about what happened there, you'll find eyes dropping, shoulders tightening. Not from guilt, but fear. Because Tanacu has a scar, not visible, not spoken, but felt in the cold shadow of the monastery on the hill. The Tanacu monastery was isolated, not just geographically, but spiritually. No electricity, no internet, no modern distractions, just stone, wood, and ritual. Time moved differently there. Days were measured in prayer, nights in silence. The rules weren't posted, they were inherited. This wasn't a place that adapted to the modern world. It refused to, and that was exactly what drew her in. Her name was Marițica Irina Cornici. She was 23 when she arrived. She didn't look haunted, not yet. She looked like someone running, not from danger, but from noise. A quiet woman with eyes too old for her age, shoulders hunched not from fatigue, but from years of carrying things no one ever saw. She had returned to Romania alone. No one was waiting for her. She brought nothing but a small bag and a request to join the monastery, to serve, to disappear. Irina had spent most of her life without roots. Born in Romania, she was abandoned before memory began. No names in the family tree, no photos on mantels. The orphanage was her only home, a grey slab of concrete and routine. Her childhood was a system, not a life. Rules replaced love, meals came on schedule, attention was currency, and Irina never had enough of it. She didn't cry much. She learned not to. Tears didn't help. Neither did talking. She was the kind of child who faded into corners. Not a troublemaker, not a favorite. Just there, quiet, small, and easy to overlook. Her world was made of shared beds, recycled clothes, and walls that echoed with the confusion of too many forgotten children. She wasn't mistreated, but she was never seen. At 18, she aged out. The system made no plans for her. There were no letters, no family outreach. She simply left. A quiet departure into a world she'd never been prepared for. She traveled to Germany, found domestic work with Romanian families. She was a nanny, a cleaner, an invisible helper. She kept her head down, worked hard, and left no trace. Her employers called her polite, distant, and odd. She wasn't violent, she wasn't aggressive, but she was off. She spoke to herself under her breath. She stared too long at empty corners, laughed at nothing, whispered prayers when no one was watching. She said her skin felt wrong, that the walls breathed too loudly. She once said she could hear the sky grinding its teeth. Her employers began to worry, not enough to call help, but enough to keep their distance. Doctors weren't consulted, she wasn't insured, and mental health care was a luxury for undocumented workers. She began drifting, changing jobs, moving between apartments. Then she vanished. No message, no trail, just gone. By the time she reached Tanacu, she was already slipping. She didn't say much, just that she wanted to be close to God, that she needed peace, that she was tired of noise. The nuns took her in. The monastery's rules were strict, but Irina didn't protest. She followed orders, woke at dawn, prayed until her knees ached, scrubbed floors, slept on straw. There were no mirrors, no phones, no distractions. It was a life of sacrifice, and for a moment, just a moment, she seemed okay. But peace, in Tanacu, was always fragile. It began small. She stopped taking communion. She said the bread tasted like ashes. She flinched during prayers, eyes darting toward unseen things. She began muttering at night, words the other sisters didn't understand. Her eyes would fix on doorways, refusing to blink. She said the crucifixes stared at her. She said something was living behind the walls. She said it watched her sleep. She wept suddenly with no cause. And then she laughed, shrill, broken laughter that felt like a crack in something deeper. The others began to fear her. They whispered. They prayed harder. They cleansed the chapel. But nothing changed. And then, one morning, she stood barefoot in the center of the sanctuary. Her arms were spread. Her skin was bleeding where she had scratched herself raw. Her mouth moved, speaking what sounded like Latin, but in reverse. She collapsed. The nuns ran to her, but she screamed when they touched her. They didn't know what to do. But one man did. Father Daniel Petru Corojanu was not officially a priest. Not anymore. He had been defrocked by the Romanian Orthodox Church years before, officially for insubordination, unofficially for obsession. He believed too deeply, or maybe too literally. Demons to him were not symbols of moral failings. They were real, present, hungry. He believed Irina was not mentally ill. He believed she was possessed. He told the sisters that medicine could not fix this, that hospitals might sedate her body but would leave the soul to rot. He claimed to see it in her eyes, that something inside her was not human, that it hated scripture, that it recoiled at prayer, that it wanted to corrupt the monastery. Some nuns hesitated. One begged him to call for a doctor, but he said no. "You do not negotiate with demons," he told them. "You fight." And so they prepared. The sisters followed Daniel's lead. His conviction gave them certainty. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply spoke with the weight of someone who knew. In a place ruled by silence and obedience, that was enough. They began by cleansing the monastery, holy water in every room, prayers chanted for hours. Irina was isolated in a small chamber behind the sanctuary. They told her it was for her safety. She didn't protest. Not at first. She seemed confused, detached. Then came the resistance. She screamed during Vespers, smashed her forehead against the wall until it bled. She begged to be let out, her voice hoarse with terror. The other nuns tried to comfort her, but she recoiled as if they burned. She said the shadows whispered, that the Virgin Mary had turned her back, that her name had been stolen and replaced with a number. "I'm not here," she said again and again. "I'm not here." Daniel took it as confirmation. He told the sisters to remain steadfast. Evil resists salvation. Pain is the price of liberation. She is a battlefield, he said, and we are God's soldiers. They brought her into the sanctuary. A wooden cross was placed on the floor. Rough, makeshift, 2 beams bound with rope. They tied her to it using torn strips from old sheets. Her ankles, her wrists, her shoulders. One nun was tasked with holding her head when she thrashed. Another kept a bucket nearby in case she vomited. They stuffed a cloth in her mouth, not to silence her, they claimed, but to keep her from biting her own tongue. She fought at first, screamed, kicked, cursed in voices that weren't her own, or so they said. Her eyes rolled back. Her body convulsed. The nuns crossed themselves. Daniel stood over her, reading from Scripture, his voice sharp, deliberate. Psalms, verses from Mark and Matthew, prayers of exorcism that hadn't been used in Orthodox tradition for centuries. They prayed for hours. Each sister took shifts. They skipped meals. They bled from their palms where rosary beads had bitten into their skin. Irina cried, pleaded, then fell silent. Her breathing grew shallow. Her skin turned pale. But Daniel insisted this was a sign. It's leaving her, he said. It's resisting. On the second day, her lips cracked. Her voice was gone. She mouthed words, but no sound came. The cloth in her mouth was damp with saliva and blood. Flies hovered in the heat. She had not been given water. Daniel said the body must be denied comfort to weaken the demon's grip. Fasting is divine warfare, he told them. That night, one of the younger nuns collapsed from exhaustion. Another wept in the garden, begging God for guidance. But Daniel would not allow weakness. You must endure, as Christ endured. The sisters obeyed. They barely slept. The chapel stank of sweat, old wax, and something sharper, sour like decay. No windows were open. The candles burned low. The cross creaked under Irina's weight. Her wrists were bruised deep purple. Her arms hung limp. Her head drooped. Her body trembled without rhythm. Daniel stood over her, muttering a final prayer. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with urgency. He believed they were close, that this was the last stronghold of evil inside her. He touched her forehead. "The Lord rebuke thee," he whispered. Irina did not respond. By morning she was gone. Her chest no longer rose. Her lips were blue. Her eyes, when one nun gently pried them open, were glassy, still. For a moment, no one moved. The silence felt suffocating. Then Daniel stepped back. He looked down at her and crossed himself. "She is free," he said. No one called an ambulance. No one ran to the village. They washed her body with cold water, wrapped her in a wool blanket, laid her on a wooden board beneath the altar. Daniel read from the book of Revelation. The nuns sang softly, their voices raw, breaking. One fainted. Another vomited, but no one disobeyed. Hours passed. A villager came by with supplies. He knocked, waited. A nun opened the gate, her hands stained, her eyes empty. He asked where the girl was, the one who had joined a few weeks ago. The nun hesitated, said she was resting. The man looked past her, saw something he couldn't name. He left quickly. He called the authorities. By sunset, the police arrived. When the police entered the Tanacu monastery, they didn't expect what they found. The building was still, dimly lit, candles burning low in the windows. The nuns didn't run or resist. They didn't scream or cry out. They stood in silence, heads bowed, hands folded. Their expressions weren't panicked. They were solemn, as though they had just returned from a funeral. In their minds, maybe they had. The officers found Irina's body laid out on a wooden board, wrapped in wool, surrounded by half-burned candles and open Bibles. Her wrists were visibly bruised, her lips cracked, her face pale and gaunt. They took one look at her condition and radioed for an ambulance, though they already knew it was too late. The paramedics confirmed what everyone suspected. She had died hours ago, likely of dehydration, exhaustion, and shock. When asked what had happened, Father Daniel answered plainly, "We performed an exorcism. She was possessed. She is at peace now." The nuns echoed him. They said Irina had been tormented, that she had begged for salvation, that they had seen signs, voices, visions, objects moving, that her body had twisted unnaturally, her voice had deepened, her eyes had glowed with something inhuman. They said she had needed saving, that Daniel had saved her soul, but the investigators weren't looking for demons, they were looking for facts. And the facts were damning. Irina had not eaten in days. She hadn't had water. She'd been restrained for over 72 hours in a position that restricted circulation. The bruising on her arms and ankles was severe. Her lips had split. Her body bore the marks of prolonged stress and trauma. To the police, it wasn't a matter of religion. It was a case of neglect, abuse, and manslaughter. Father Daniel and 4 nuns were arrested on the spot. The news spread quickly. In Romania, the story exploded. Exorcism kills young woman. Priest claims demon responsible. Monastery, death shocks nation. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a scandal. Talk shows debated the role of faith in mental health. Church leaders scrambled to distance themselves. The Romanian Orthodox Church publicly condemned the act. They reiterated that Daniel had already been defrocked, that the monastery was unofficial, unsanctioned, and dangerous. They stated clearly, exorcism is not practiced outside formal rituals and never under those conditions, but the people weren't so sure. Romania is a country where faith runs deep, where Orthodox icons are found in kitchens and bus stations, where the line between medicine and mysticism still blurs in the minds of many. And in some corners, people supported Daniel. They believed his story. They said he was being punished for defending his flock, that the girl had truly been possessed, that demons were real and no courtroom could judge spiritual warfare. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered to pray. They held crosses and candles. They wept. "He saved her," they said. "She was already gone. He brought her back." Inside, the trial began. Prosecutors called medical experts who described Irina's condition in detail: dehydration, starvation, signs of restraint and trauma. Her death, they said, had not been supernatural. It had been physical, painful, preventable. The defense leaned into faith. They argued that Daniel believed she was possessed, that his intent had not been to harm, but to heal, that the nuns had followed him out of loyalty, trust, and spiritual duty. They painted Irina not as a victim, but as a soul in peril, one whose last days were spent in sacred struggle. Then came testimony from those who had known her before. Former employers from Germany spoke about her odd behavior, her disconnection from reality, her paranoia. A few described moments that sounded like psychosis, auditory hallucinations, disorganized speech, episodes of withdrawal. They said they didn't know where she went. They didn't expect her to come back. Psychiatrists were called. They reviewed her records, what little existed, and made educated guesses. They said Irina likely suffered from schizophrenia or a related disorder, that she needed medical care, medication, support, that what happened to her was the result of ignorance, not evil, not demons, but untreated illness. The jury listened. So did the world. By now, the Tanacu Exorcism had become more than a headline. It was a lightning rod for debate: science versus faith, tradition versus modernity, belief versus responsibility. People asked, where does spiritual care end and medical negligence begin? Who decides whether a soul is sick or a mind is ill? And if you truly believe you are saving someone, are you still guilty when they die? The trial stretched on. On the day of the verdict, the courthouse steps were lined with both protesters and supporters. The air was thick with incense and tension. News cameras rolled. Journalists jostled for position. Some carried microphones, others clutched crucifixes. Behind the courtroom windows, history was being written. The jury deliberated for several hours. Their task was not simple. They had to weigh intent against consequence, faith against law. In the end, they returned with a unanimous decision. Father Daniel was found guilty of unlawful deprivation of liberty, resulting in death. The 4 nuns, Sister Edina, Sister Nicoletta, Sister Elena, and Sister Maria, were also found guilty, though their sentences varied based on their level of involvement and influence. Daniel received a sentence of 7 years in prison. The nuns received sentences ranging from 5 to 6 years. When the verdict was read, Daniel bowed his head, crossed himself, and said only one word: Amen. The nuns wept. Some looked at him as if awaiting direction, as if even in judgment he was still their shepherd. Outside, the reaction was divided. Some cheered, others cried. There were those who felt justice had finally been served, that Irina's death had not gone unanswered. But others saw it as a miscarriage of justice, punishment for belief, for faith, for conviction in a higher power. The line between murderer and martyr had never felt so thin. Daniel served 4 years before being released for good behavior. During his imprisonment, he remained largely unrepentant. In interviews, he insisted that he had done what he believed was right, that Irina had been afflicted, that she had begged for help, that the church had abandoned her, and he had done what no one else would. He listened. He acted. He said, "I didn't kill her, the demon did." The nuns also served partial sentences before being released. Upon their release, they vanished from public life. Some returned to rural communities under new names. Others retreated to small parishes where they lived quietly, away from the cameras, away from the questions. And what of the church? The Romanian Orthodox Church officially distanced itself from the Tanacu monastery. They reiterated their previous warnings that Daniel had no authority, that he had been defrocked, that the monastery was never approved. They denounced the act, but quietly, behind closed doors, they also acknowledged a growing tension because something else had happened in the wake of Irina's death, a kind of resurgence. Exorcisms increased, not officially, not openly, but underground. Quiet rituals, performed in darkened rooms by priests and believers who felt the world had grown too secular, too cold, too dismissive of spiritual suffering. In villages like Tanacu, whispers returned. People claimed to see signs, to feel presences. Some said Irina's death had opened a door, others said it had closed one. Books were written, documentaries filmed. Films were made, most famously Beyond the Hills, directed by Christian Mungiu, which dramatized Irina's final days. The film won awards, stirred more debate, and etched the Tanacu case into cinematic history. But the real Irina, the woman beneath, the headlines beneath the horror, remained a mystery. She had no family to speak for her. No childhood photos in yearbooks, no journals. No legacy beyond the tragedy. In life, she was mostly invisible. In death, she became a symbol, twisted, politicized, immortalized. Some say she was mentally ill, Others say she was spiritually afflicted. A few say she was both, but no one can say she was helped. Not really. Her grave is small. A wooden cross. A patch of grass in a quiet cemetery near Vaslui. Sometimes flowers appear there. No one knows who leaves them. And the monastery, it was shuttered. Officially closed by the state. But the building still stands, weathered, empty. The stone walls streaked with rain. The rooms silent. Some say they hear things if they stand outside, chanting, whispers, footsteps. But that's probably just legend. Or maybe it's grief echoing. The story of the Tanacu Exorcism didn't end in that courtroom. It lingers in sermons, in psychology textbooks, in whispered prayers and midnight documentaries. It lingers because it touches something raw in us. The fear of madness, the desperation for meaning, the terrible cost of belief. It asks questions we still don't know how to answer. What does it mean to be possessed? Who gets to decide what is madness and what is spiritual crisis? Can you be guilty if you were trying to save someone? And how do we protect the vulnerable when the ones hurting them truly believe they're helping? Tanacu doesn't answer those questions. It just reminds us that sometimes faith becomes a weapon, that love, twisted by fear, can destroy, and that the line between holy and horrifying is thinner than we'd like to admit. In the years that followed, Romania changed. Not dramatically, not overnight. But the Tanacu case had left its mark, etched into public consciousness like a scar that refuses to fade. Mental health care, long stigmatized and chronically underfunded, entered the public conversation in a new way. Politicians debated reforms, psychologists published urgent calls for awareness, and advocacy groups pushed for better training, more resources, and, above all, greater compassion for those suffering in silence. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Irina's death might become a turning point, a catalyst for change in a system crippled by neglect. But systems, especially those rooted in tradition and bureaucracy, change slowly, especially in rural places like Tanacu, where the pace of the modern world feels distant and disconnected, where suspicion of outsiders remains strong, and where the church often serves as both spiritual refuge and social authority. In those villages, life continued as it always had. Church bells still tolled at dawn and dusk. Candles flickered in dim chapels. The faithful still turned to prayer when faced with fear or uncertainty. Not out of cruelty, but out of a profound belief that faith is the one constant in a shifting world. What made the Tanacu exorcism so deeply disturbing wasn't just what happened in that monastery, it was how easily it could happen again. How vulnerability, confusion and pain can be mistaken for sin. How institutions, both religious and medical, can fail the very people they are meant to protect. How ignorance and fear, when left unchecked, can lead to tragedy. Irina wasn't the first to be lost in that dangerous space between faith and medicine. And sadly, she will not be the last. The Tanacu exorcism was more than a tragedy. It was a prism showing us the many ways people interpret suffering. To the nuns, Irina was a soul gripped by darkness. To Father Daniel, she was a battleground in a cosmic war of good versus evil. To the doctors who had once treated her, she was a young woman in the throes of psychosis. To the media, she was a sensational headline. To the courts, a victim of negligence and cruelty. But who was she to herself? That question will forever remain unanswered. Irina left no diary. She gave no interviews. Her own voice is absent from the records. All we have are fragments, memories and statements from others, filtered through their beliefs, fears and regrets. She once said, "The air buzzes too loudly." She once said, "The ground moves even when I'm still." She once said, "God has stopped listening," yet she sought sanctuary in the monastery. She wanted peace. She wanted to serve. She searched for something sacred and found a fate that was anything but. Today, Irina's story is studied in universities, not only in theology classes, but in psychology, ethics, and media studies. It is dissected, debated, and reinterpreted. Everyone has a theory, a diagnosis, a moral to draw. But at its core, Tanacu is not a parable or a cautionary tale. It is a wound, a deep and aching reminder of how fragile human beings can be, how desperate we become when we feel unseen and unheard, and how dangerous it is when certainty blinds compassion. Father Daniel lives in obscurity now. Occasionally, journalists track him down. When they do, he speaks briefly, rarely reflecting remorse. He says the world has only grown darker, that people confuse demons with diseases, and that if given the chance he would do it again. The church excommunicated him, but in some rural towns where faith runs deep and modern skepticism is thin, some still see him as a healer, a man who stood bravely against unseen evil. But many others remember differently. They remember the bruises on Irina's wrists and ankles, the signs of dehydration and neglect, the eerie silence after her final breath, the prayers that became instruments of suffering. There is a word that echoes in every discussion of Tanacu: belief. Belief is what led Irina to the monastery. Belief is what led Daniel to reject medicine. Belief is what led the nuns to ignore their instinct. Belief is what still divides opinions today. But belief, when unchecked by empathy and reason, can become cruelty. Faith, severed from reality and compassion, can become fatal. Irina was not a symbol or a prophecy. She was a young woman in desperate need of care, the kind that listens without judgment, that blends science with compassion, and that recognizes the complexity of human suffering. She did not need to be crucified in the name of salvation. She needed help, real help. Yet in a world that too often spiritualizes or punishes pain, her story became a warning, a reminder that the line between devotion and delusion is not drawn in scripture, but in action. Once crossed, it leaves scars on bodies, on souls, and on history. Now it falls to us, families, communities, medical professionals, faith leaders, and individuals, to remember Irina not as a cautionary tale, but as a person. To challenge and change the systems that failed her, whether religious, medical, or legal, to listen more carefully, believe more wisely, and never again mistake suffering for sin. Because the next time it could be someone you know, someone you love, someone who whispers in the dark that the ground moves and the air buzzes too loudly. And when they come to you, what will you do? Will you listen, or will you pray the demon away? The Tanacu Exorcism also teaches us about the danger of isolation. Irina's story shows how loneliness and abandonment can deepen mental suffering, how being unseen can twist a person's reality until the line between inside and outside blurs. The monastery was supposed to be a place of refuge, a sanctuary, but it became a prison of silence, fear, and misunderstanding. Isolation feeds desperation. It fuels the unseen demons of the mind. And when people are isolated from community, medical care, and understanding, tragedies like Tanacu become more likely. So beyond belief, beyond faith or medicine, we must remember this. Connection saves lives. Connection to others who listen without judgment, connection to professionals who understand complexity, connection to communities that care enough to see beyond fear. If we fail to build these bridges, we risk repeating the same mistakes. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and also press the bell icon. Bye-bye.